over time, a super small, silly thing like not hitting the snooze button every day and literally getting up when you say you're going to can lead to huge transformations that look a lot like, starting your own business or running a marathon or, paying for your kids' private school education because that's what your goal is.
Welcome to Amy Liz Harrison's podcast, Eternally Amy, a mum of eight's journey from jail to joy. A Gen Xer who overcame her struggle with alcohol to become a best-selling author and mental health advocate. She shares stories of hope and offers ideas for others struggling with mental health challenges, spirituality, ADHD, or maybe just family, travel, and logistics. One thing is for sure, you'll leave with something to chew on. And now, here's your host, Amy Liz Harrison, with your mystery meat sandwich.
Okay, greetings, compadres. Greetings. All right, today we have the pleasure of having Shelby John with us. And what that means is we're not doing a mystery meat sandwich. No, we're going straight to lockdown. We're going to get our orange jumpsuits on. We're going straight behind bars. And we're going to start with the chaplain's chat. So here's the deal. This is why I'm so excited. I actually was on her podcast the other day and I loved her. I'm so happy that you're here, Shelby. And so, okay, here we go. Shelby is a coach, a therapist, and host of aforementioned the Confident Sober Woman podcast. She has a course that gives you step-by-step instructions on calming the brain and the body to reduce anxiety and panic attacks. She designed this program for serious action takers who want to transform from feeling unsatisfied, overwhelmed, and anxious and afraid. Anybody relate? Anybody? To calm, capable, confident, and free. And who doesn't love that? She is a sober woman who shows other sober women how to build the confidence they need to pursue their desires beyond recovery. Welcome, Shelby.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm pumped you're on here today. And I'm just wondering if we could start by just however much you're comfortable sharing about your background, just what led you to get to the place where you are today and doing the work that you do.
Sure. So what it was like, a little bit of what happened and what it's like today, maybe.
Sure.
I was, I grew up in a regular home, lovely, loving family. My mom was divorced. My father left our family when I was 5 years old and my sister was 2. And I only mention that because I do believe that was the trauma central item for me, right? They created like a feeling of abandonment, a feeling of lack of worth, not good enough, that kind of grew and created the neural pathway in my brain that made those negative thoughts and beliefs kind of last the test of time, right? So my mom did marry another man who was a loving father and really took us in as his own. And I had a brother from that marriage, and we really did have a lovely home. It wasn't an alcoholic home. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of heavy drinking. So we were raised with a lot of parties and alcohol and stuff, but it wasn't really out of control or, kind of what some people may have experienced as an alcoholic home. I was a little bit of a late bloomer. I started drinking a little bit later in high school. I was the oldest of 3 kids, and my parents were kind of strict. So I was just scared to do anything like that. I did start dating my now husband, in high school. We were 16 when we started dating. So so we had him, and I kind of used to drive those boys around while they drank, and I was always the kind of responsible one and had a curfew and all the things. So, but when I went to college, I went 6 hours away out of state, and prior to that, I was already feeling a lot of that, like not fitting in, not good enough, not pretty enough, thin enough, smart enough. Even though I was kind of in like the in crowd, I was an athlete, but I never really felt a part of any of that. So those feelings were already there. We're kind of really doing push-ups in the parking lot and getting stronger. And so by the time I left home and was on my own, I was off to the races, certainly with my substance abuse, because now I was, free and on my own. And I discovered some other activities, and things just kind of went from there. I really was very reckless. I put myself in a lot of dangerous situations. I made really poor decisions. And somehow I survived that. I was very depressed, although, again, on the outside, you wouldn't have necessarily known it. I was kind of checking off all the boxes of life. But I did have my first suicide attempt in college. That was very private. Nobody even knew that happened. And then I transferred to get closer to my now husband, who was going to college here. And I had a lot of that perfectionism and sort of overachiever style personality. And like when I was growing up, there was just all of this chaos on the inside. And now I know, looking back, that I believe that chaos was really just anxiety. We just didn't call it that back then. So now I had a little bit more of a name for it. But when I got to the second college, there was just so much of that. I was just so stuck in self, and really the disease was had its grips on me for sure. I had problems with eating disorder, a really disordered eating, a relationship with food, really disordered relationship with exercise. And so I was very highly functional, but I was so internally dead. I didn't have any kind of spiritual program or moral component or any of that. And so, I was lost. I think I was just really lost in my own disease and darkness. And again, at the time, I was doing all of the things. I was participating in my life. I was going to school. I graduated college. I got a job. We bought a little house and, did all the things, again, checking off those boxes. And, all the while, things were just getting worse for me inside. And the disease was taking over more and more. I went to grad school. Same kind of stuff happened. Really perfectionist, had to get straight A's. I was obsessive. I had like substance-induced bipolar disorder. So I was really just acting out in a lot of bizarro ways. And at the end, I had a pretty major, potentially career-ending legal situation that I go into extensive detail in my book, if you want to read about it. But that was a whole scene. And then out as a result of that, my husband and my parents found a bed for me in a local treatment facility. And I was off to the races. And back then, that was July 1st, 2002. It was the first day of what I call my second life. And we didn't have as many resources that we do today. There wasn't all like Quit Lit and, big national organizations of advocacy and, treatment programs and things. So I went to 12-step because that's what was available to me at the time. And I followed the program as it was presented to me. And for me, it worked really well. I was too scared not to do what I was told because my life was already getting so much better, even after a super short time of being sober. So I kind of just wanted to stay the course, even though it took me probably over a year to fully accept that I was an alcoholic. I mean, I would sit in the rooms because, again, I was too scared not to, but I would still say things like, I don't really belong here, or I wasn't that bad. And my story wasn't that bad. And, thank God for good sponsorship and for people like coaches and therapists who were able to shed some light on, okay, maybe it wasn't that bad, but the things that I had, like maybe on my resentment list or my fourth step or whatever, they were pretty big things. The list wasn't very long, but they were pretty large things that were creating a lot of emotional wreckage. So, that's just kind of what happened for me. I got sober in 12-step. That's what worked for me. I didn't know any other way. And my experience was very positive. I got pregnant at 6 months sober, and then I had 2 more kids in 4 years. So I had these 3 babies that was a whole lot. And that was very life-changing. So I'm this newly sober person trying to get and stay sober and learn all the things and also parent these babies with a husband who had a huge job. And was a lot. I loved them and it was a wonderful time, but it was also very exhausting and just so much. I think I was still filled with more fear at that time and a little bit more anxiety and more of just that I don't know what to do and I don't know if I'm good enough mom or if I'm doing the right things. Some of the things that probably most moms experience, but I cried a lot and I did a lot of healthy things too. We went to the gym every day. I tried to take care of myself. It's always in a very obsessive way. That's just how I do things, And around 4 years sober, after I had that third kid, a little while after that, I had what I call like my first sober bottom. I was really struggling. I kind of was just so overwhelmed. I was lonely and maybe a little depressed, and I needed help. I needed something, but I really wasn't doing a lot of the things that I've been taught to do or was shown to do. I kind of had turned my back on. I still went to meetings, I think, at that time, but I wasn't super active in things. I wasn't actively pursuing a spiritual program. I was sort of like purposefully turning my back on God and saying like, I'm just like stomping my feet, kind of having a tantrum. And I think that's funny when we do that. It makes me laugh when I look back at those times, but that's really what it was like. Like, I know this is going to work, but I'm not going to do it. And that's where I was, and at that time I really reached back out to the people who I knew before who could help me, and some new people too, and said, I need help. And they, opened their arms and said, we've been waiting for you. And and that's just kind of how it went for me. From there, it just began a long road of never ending recovery work that is that of emotional sobriety, right? The stuff that we need to do to learn how to live well in recovery, to really learn how to accept life on life's terms, and to deal with those big emotions and relationships, because all of us have all of that. And it doesn't matter how sober you are. Too, like we talked about this before, my kids are teenagers now. And as they became teenagers, that was a very difficult time in parenting and marriage. And so for me, that took me to new heights. I never wanted to drink or use. That's never been a problem for me. But there are other ways for me to hurt myself or go back to addictive behaviors that have nothing to do with substances. So I found myself caught in some of those cycles that I've had to work my way out of. And I needed a lot of outside help for that. And, I've been a therapist for a long time. I've been in the field since I graduated grad school back in 2002. And I went in private practice when my kids were young, just because that's what made sense, because I can be flexible. Today, I get the opportunity to work with women or anybody who comes to my practice who wants to heal their trauma. I use EMDR therapy to really work on their past trauma. And online, I've created a couple different programs and signature courses, as well as coaching packages to help those women build confidence beyond recovery, because sobriety is only the beginning. We get sober, we generally do get well, but once we're in that like 1 to 5 year sobriety range, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of awakening, and this clarity that comes when along with that, a lot of times a sense of, I don't know who I am now. I don't know what I like. I don't really like this relationship, or I want a relationship. All of these things start to come up because we're not super focused every single moment on just stay sober, and so that's where I love to meet women right around that time and bring them in and start to help them really understand the desires of their heart and build a roadmap towards discovering those things, and help teach them how to learn how to trust themselves. And ultimately, all of those things lead to like just more confidence and really more joy in their sober lives.
Okay, that was an amazing story. And you said so much. I wrote like all these notes off on the side, tried to make it nonchalant. But you said so many things that actually sort of pierced me. And one of those things was just now when you were talking about identity and you were talking about losing your identity. I totally felt the same way when I had kids and became a mom, and just kind of was in this whole world of like, who am I? And then I did that again, getting sober. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think as women, we do that at several different points in our lives. Right. Like I'm thinking about that even now with, menopause coming up for me somewhere in the near, 10-year, 15-year future, whatever. That's something that we as women have the ability to do, but sometimes need the tools, to be able to convince ourselves that we are capable,
Mm-hmm. I do know. And I mean, I even feel like I'm in a little bit of the beginning stages of a transition with my kids, kind of like your older kids. Now you have the other younger ones coming up, but I mean, we're transitioning into the next phase, you know. I mean, we've got one in college, the next one's a senior, and my son is a freshman. And so they are pulling away and becoming their own people. Of course, we are heavily involved. They still need us, but we are definitely starting, when I say we, my husband and I, but also very much me, trying to really create a little bit of a roadmap for what does this look like for me when they're gone. You know, like, yes, they will always be a huge part of my life. Yes, I would love to travel to see them, or, you know, be with grandkids or whatever is going to happen. But, you know, how do I spend my time? Like, who are my friends? You know, and those things have changed throughout my last decade or so too, because, you know, our kids went to different schools, you know, we weren't on the same fields anymore. And so sort of your friends change. And then in this new decade that's coming up, I'm wondering, like, I'm still trying to look for those people. Who are my people going to be? You know, what are my husband and I going to do together? What are my things going to be? You know, do I have a new hobby? Like, these kinds of things, I think, as we age and stage, are really important. But what I see sometimes is a lot of women who don't spend any time really thinking about that, or they're in denial, or it's just too overwhelming. And then it comes and they're just super lost, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I love the whole, touching on friendships, the whole concept, right? Of that's exactly what I've seen happen in my life, especially like post-pandemic and pre-pandemic, and just the friends who are kind of in your life for a season, for a reason. Some are short-term, some are long-term. And, you know, I believe we can learn so much from each individual friendship. But gosh, it's funny, you know, I think there was something in my brain that told me, gosh, by the time I'm 46, I just will have the friendship thing totally nailed down. And even that is a little bit, you know, it's kind of like an earthquake at times, and then little aftershocks, and then it feels real steady for a long time, and then it changes again. And just to ride those ebbs and flows is, it's not always easy.
It hasn't been easy for me either. And I don't know, maybe everyone, I think that some of this is sort of tough for me. Maybe, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I had a problem with comparing out a lot. I don't do it as much. And I'm not comparing out as far as like my abilities, or am I doing things right or not, like not that kind of, but more just like, oh, like Amy is always with all her friends. Like, look at these pictures of her with her friends on Instagram. Like, oh my gosh, she's on a girls' weekend. Like, no one ever invites me on a girls' weekend. Like, stuff like that, where I'm like longing for these deeper connections. And I think for me, I don't know about your experience, I think we talked about this on my show, particularly when the kids were little, but it's still happening for sure. Like, I'm just not really interested in anything that's not going to be real raw and authentic.
Right.
I understand that as adults, like, you know, I kind of grew up with parents who were lovely and, you know, social, but also kind of private, like, oh, you don't talk about, you know, politics or religion or money, you know, with your friends. And I'm like, why not? Like, I mean, I kind of like, who else do you talk about it with? Like, I kind of need someone to talk to about that stuff, or just be like, say like, oh my gosh, my husband's being a real jerk right now. Like, what do you do when your husband's a jerk? You know, like I just don't, I'm not interested in like some of the
sugarcoating
stuff. Yeah. Like, and so now I find that eliminates a lot of people. And so now I'm down to like, well, gosh, I'm left with like one person, you know, like, and so I find myself actually trying to find some newer friendships. And I really actually in my kind of meditation and prayer time, I've really over the last 2 years been kind of prayerful about that, like asking kind of for, you know, I call my high power God, just to kind of bring the right women into my life, because I don't know where they are, and I've tried to find them. And, you know, I work alone in my basement. I don't, you know, I just would really love to meet some women who like want to hang out and do fun things, but also can talk about the real stuff.
Absolutely. No, I totally know what you mean. I'm in a similar boat. And I'm just curious, how do we begin to, the roadmap that you're talking about, how do we begin to take the first, you know, few steps to even figure out what that roadmap might look like for us?
Do you mean on on the self-identity piece?
Yeah, or friendships, or any kind of something where we're feeling kind of like maybe a little bit off kilter, not even necessarily in an anxiety kind of panic attack spin, but just these big seasons in our life that you were just referring to. It's just a lot.
Right. It is a lot. I'm a big fan of kind of like getting into the basics, I mean, if anybody's been around 12-step programs, that's the kind of language we use, like get back to the basics.
ABCs.
Typical phrase, but I think of basics meaning just like the basic natural ways of life, meaning how are you treating yourself? Like, let's just get down to the general nitty gritty. Like, how's your skincare? What are you putting in your body, in your mouth? How is your sleep? Are you drinking a gallon of water a day? Are you moving your body every day? Like, let's just come up with some of the really basic things of life about how are you treating yourself? How are you speaking to yourself? So checking in with our thoughts. Are they friendly? Are they kind? Or are they real ugly and kind of nasty? And we've all had some of both of those, right? And so that's a big part of the work I do. I usually really work with women immediately on checking in with their thought patterns. Negative thinking patterns is something that we attack right in the beginning, because most of the time, particularly in those earlier years of sobriety or any time, those are still very glaring. They were for me. For me, it took years. This is years of work it took me. And I think people can do it much faster if they have the right people in their life to help them. I was kind of navigating this a little bit on my own, and then maybe with some people who weren't as aggressive, right? And so attacking those, or understanding what those thought patterns are, and then sort of what triggers those, and then learning how to reverse them is like a huge first step in that roadmap. The other thing is really connecting with your daily habits and routines. To me, this is like, I know it's so cliche and all the influencers talk about it, and we got the plaques on Instagram saying like your morning routine. And I mean, and I'm saying it because it's this important, and there's even like research now that supports this. So it's not just me being like silly or whatever. There's like true research and big influencers, big, huge names, Brenda Burchard, Mel Robbins, Amy Porterfield, people who are well doing 7-figure businesses are talking about these things because they really are that important, right? So the reason why it's so important too is because when we start to establish very healthy habits and routines, because we all have habits and routines, but a lot of them aren't the healthy kind, we want to kind of switch them and reestablish the healthy ones. We start to train our brain to that we mean what we say. So when we consistently do things that are against what our personal core values are, or what we say we're going to do, our brain like doesn't believe us. And so that's kind of what I meant by building trust in yourself. So it's not going to believe you if you're a snooze button hitter and you consistently do that, and then you say, well, tomorrow I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. and I'm going to the gym, or I'm going to go out for a jog. Your brain is like, no, you're not. Like you say that all the time, and you hit the snooze button 7 times. It's like, you're not doing that. And so it just doesn't believe you. But so then if you consistently make it a point that you say, this is a non-negotiable, I'm doing this thing, I'm just using this as an example, it could be any number of things, and you consistently do that over time, you retrain your brain and those neural pathways that are created in your brain because of these daily actions, that you can trust, that your brain can trust what you say. And so over time, a super small, silly thing like not hitting the snooze button every day and literally getting up when you say you're going to can lead to huge transformations that look a lot like, starting your own business, or running a marathon, or, paying for your kids' private school education because that's what your goal is. So these tiny little micro habits that seem like, just because I hit the snooze button, there's no way I'm running a marathon. Like, it's hard to make the leap, but if you learn how to create the leap and then back into it, you're going to get to these tiny micro changes that are done consistently every single day over time that lead to that huge transformation. So that's that's really the big starting point for a lot
Yeah.
of this, and can be applied to whatever it is that you're looking to do, whether it's create self-identity or whether it's building more confidence or self-awareness. Kind of all of those things start with some of these really basic things.
I love it too, because, the thing about getting sober, I would say for me, and I think that this just applies to life in general, but it's like all these massive changes, it's not like flipping a light switch and then the next day forevermore, we're this different person who does all these different things, but it's like chipping away at it, one little change at a time. And I love that you use the example of the clock, the snooze alarm. My son, a couple years ago, teenage boys, I don't know what, like it's got to be scientific at some level, but they just struggle. They go through a phase where it's like you have to drag them out of their bed and like put them in the shower practically. Like it's that whole, they're just so sleep deprived and they're growing and they're, hormonal and all of that. And my son, decided that he was going to get up for football workouts, and he was working towards a goal of doing that all summer. And he was great for the first couple of mornings. Then by the third morning, my husband went down there because he was running a little bit late. My son was a little bit late to get up. My husband went down and said, hey, it's time to get up. And my son didn't want to get up. My husband said, don't let your body dictate what your mind already decided that it's going to do. And ever since that day, I don't know, it was like some lightning struck my son, but he gets up every single day like clockwork, like it's at the military, and he does those workouts. And you know what? He's a transformed kid, not just physically, but mentally. He is not the same. And it's beautiful to watch that transformation. And if women, if we can claim that for ourselves and see the power of that in our lives, how transformative that would be, I imagine, is incredible to see as a therapist and somebody in your seat.
It is incredible. I love that example. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's so powerful. And we should all sort of re-listen to that and write it down. I mean, Mel Robbins uses a similar concept, but she just says, you're never going to feel like it.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to feel like it. Most times, I don't care who you are, Olympic athletes, they're not going to feel like getting up at 4 a.m. for their workouts every single day. They're just not. I don't. I get up super early every single morning. I have a long morning routine. And there's a lot of days when I'm dragging myself down there and I'm like, I don't feel like reading these 10 pages. I really don't feel like, and I just do it anyway, because that's what I said I was going to do. And I don't want to break my promises to myself. But if we waited till we felt like it, we mostly wouldn't do nothing,
Yeah.
So it's really hard to combat that. Like that is the difference between your brain and your body. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for that. And, I would love to hear about the negative thinking patterns, breaking those negative thinking patterns. I know personally that is something along my path of emotional sobriety that needs constant attention, way more than I ever thought. I thought, I'm not a negative person. I literally thought that. And then I started watching my thoughts and how often, even in an afternoon, I'll think something or say something in my head negative about myself. And I guess, I can't be alone, right? And I love that, you talked about those triggers and what are some of the tools that we can use as women to try and change that narrative?
You're not alone. I think that's the biggest thing that I see in my community and just in talking to women across the world, really, sober women and just any women, really. But in the sober community, I think we just see so much because we get beaten down in our active addiction so much. And there's so much shame and guilt involved with active addiction as well. And even when we're beyond that, we're often living with the patterns of that. So there are a few things that I think are super important about this that I'll share. Also, I have a Facebook group called Confident Sober Women. In there's a 5-day negative thinking challenge. It's all free. Everybody can access it. It's just in the guide section of that group. And you can literally walk through a lot of kind of what I'm going to share, but in much more detail on your own. And it's very helpful. It's extremely insightful when you do that work, even just like maybe 2, 3, 5 minutes a day, kind of look at it, go through the exercises. And if nothing else, now you're going to have a lot more awareness about your thought patterns and when they're happening than you did before. So if anybody's interested, just check that out. But the first thing I always say is it's just to have us begin to notice what our negative thoughts are.
Mm-hmm.
Generally we have a pattern. Mine's always something: I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. I'm a failure. I suck at life, stuff like that. Like that's usually where I go. If you're somebody who is a pretty intense trauma survivor, or you have a lot of abuse history in your life, things like that, it might be a lot of safety kinds of things. Like I'm not safe. I can't trust people. There might be some of that going on. Sometimes people have other different kinds of patterns. There's usually some way we normally go to it. So just becoming aware of. So meaning like when you have one during the day, try to catch it and be like, oh, that was a negative thought, and like write it down. Just like write it quick down until you have a list of a few of them, and you can be like, oh, okay, so I'm not good enough. I'm too fast a runner. I'm this, that. Here's my negative thoughts. And so once you have them, it's kind of like an inventory, right? You're kind of taking an inventory of them, and you can then begin to really understand what happened right before that, during it, like right after. Was it a comment by your spouse? Was it you opened a letter from a teacher and you were disappointed in your kid? Was it, you've made a mistake or you got in an accident? And what was happening that created that negative thought to pop into your head? So that's the next kind of phase of that. So you can understand trigger, for lack of a better word, what brings that on for you. Because knowledge is power. We can begin to make different subtle changes in our life when we understand these things. And then the next thing would be to look at each of those and begin to ask yourself, is this a rational thought or irrational? Meaning, is it true or not true? I'm not good enough. Okay, well, is that a rational thought or irrational? A rational thought means that it's true. And if it's true, then I would say to myself, well, where's the evidence that would prove that that is true? Has someone told you that? Have you had a boss say you're not good enough for this job? Has your husband said you suck at being a mom, or you're a terrible wife, or has your neighbor been like, you're terrible at keeping your yard up? Like, is there any evidence to support this statement about yourself? And if there isn't, then it's probably an irrational thought, which, let's face it, most of our negative beliefs are probably irrational. And if it's an irrational thought, then what can we do to let that go? Like, if there's no evidence to support that, then how can we let this go? How can we remove this away from our body? If it is a rational thought and there is actual evidence, which I would believe is probably rare, but in some cases, there might be actual things where you're not good at something, you're actually just not good at it. Like, I'm really not great with finances or any kind of math or numbers. It's not my skill set. I can do it. It's not my preferred thing. And I'm actually not that great at it because detail orientation is not always my best skill.
Same.
And so that's a legit kind of rational thought. And so then how can I accept that about myself? Well, then I could just say, I am good at other things. I'm not that great with finances. I can do it and I know how to ask for help if I need it. But honestly, if I can delegate that task to someone else, I'm really good at other things.
Yeah.
Right? So then you kind of understand which thoughts are rational and irrational. And then you finally want to then begin to switch these out. So a lot of that is like sort of your typical affirmation work. Some of that, the power of positivity type things. And I don't mean toxic positivity. I know that's a term going around now, but legit changing your language, like how can we change and shift from like, I'm not good enough to a much more acceptable and sort of positive statement. Now, I don't mean going extreme, like I'm the best mother that ever lived. And, like I'm the most powerful girl. We don't need to get crazy. I just mean like a gentle shift from like that negativity to like a place that's a lot more acceptable. Like, well, yeah, I'm actually not that great with finances because detail orientation is not my best skill, but I'm better at other things,
Yep.
Or something like, I'm I can do hard things, or I'm wonderfully and fearfully made, or other positive kinds of statements that don't have to mean you're not having humility or that you're trying to be boastful or gloating about yourself, but just a gentle shift away from that negative language. And language is so important in how we use words. This is something I've kind of been exploring in my later years, just understanding this, because we don't even know sometimes the things that are going to come out of our mouth, or that we're going to have thoughts about, because a lot of these are coming from stories that we've been told by other people about us,
Yes.
or to us for our whole lives. And we carry those stories throughout our lives until we make changes in them, right? So if you were, I know you were raised in a very, kind of sort of religious style home or a Christian home, and then so you were raised that way, and you're like, this is what I believe, and you said, this is what I believe, and this is what I believed, my dad believed it, my grandmother believed it, and so this is what I believe, and then maybe someone becomes an adult and they're like, well, actually, I'm not really sure about this thing. I'm not really sure, that I feel it in my heart, and it could be that, or it could be something completely different, but we start to check in on those narratives that we've been given along the way. And sometimes they've been told about us, well, you're not ever going to amount to anything, or you're not smart enough to go to college, or you're not going to be a very good mom because you're so impatient, whatever the things are. And so those kinds of thoughts get implanted in at an early age. So our language, and I can share a quick example about money. So I was working a little bit on money mindset work over the last 2 years, because I'm married to a CPA. My dad was also a CPA and a business owner. So there's a lot of financial focus in my life, and in a very positive way, some negative, but very saving oriented, and just very, things are expensive, and this, and the language that was used was very much kind of like that. That's too expensive. I can't afford that. Blah, 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 things like that. And so I found myself being the person that was saying those things all the time. I said those kinds of words and all the time. And I didn't even know I was doing that at all. And in my friendships, I might be like, oh my gosh, I love that that restaurant was so good. Oh man, it's really expensive, and I don't know why that's even important, but so what I tried to do was really begin to change my language, really look at that and say well, gosh, what is this going on about this? Is this coming from a place of feeling of lack, of scarcity, and then shifting my language to say, actually, we have a lot of resources in our family. We have quite a bit of resources, and we use them for a variety of things that are really important to us based on our personal core values, right? Like education. We send our kids to private school. That's our choice. And it's a very big commitment. So we have made the decision to use those resources for that. Well, that means that we don't go on very big vacations all year long, like some of my other friends, because those resources have been used for other things. So I started saying things like, no, even to my kids, I would say, no, we're not going to do that this time because we use those resources for other things, instead of saying we can't afford them, because that's not true. We can afford it, and we can afford it, and we could have afforded it, but we chose to use the resources for something else. And it would be fine if we wanted to do that thing, if we looked at it at the beginning of the year, whenever you do your kind of money management stuff, and said, this is something that's important to us. Let's put this in, but then some other thing might not have the resources for that thing. So just things like that can go a long way. And the same for ourselves. Maybe it's your body, you're I had a lot of body image issues, and I was always, saying horrible things to myself about my body. And, and now I just say, things like, man, my body walked a lot for me today. It carried the burden of a lot of things through this day. I'm so thankful for my legs. It sounds silly, but when you're coming from a place where you're just being so mean to yourself, instead of focusing on the bulges or this or that, or the wrinkles or the things that I don't like, I can just say, I'm really aging gracefully. I know that my body is changing, but it just means that God is at work on the way it's supposed to go, instead of being so mean.
It's so, so true. It's so good. It's so important. And, even as we age, I find it so interesting that, as we start learning some of these things that are truths and we compare them to how we were before. I mean, in my younger years, it was all about, I grew up in the 90s and it was like fat-free everything and the fat-free Snackwell's cookies and all of this stuff, and now like post-COVID, I'm overweight for what I was before, but it's kind of weird because I've changed the language. I love that phrase that you used around it. And I'm like, you know what? My body has been through a lot of stuff, in the 46 years I've been on this planet now. Like my body has been through a lot. And so I am so grateful for today that I don't have to, eat fat-free cookies all day, and I don't have to do that. I don't have to behave that way anymore because I know that my soul is who I am and it's not my shell. And of course, I have a responsibility to myself to take care of my shell as best I can to be here and to be with the people that I love, and my health is a priority, but to be shackled by all of that body image stuff is really difficult and something unique to women, I think. Maybe that's not true. Maybe I just said that off the cuff, but seems to be more so sometimes with women, I think.
I think it's mostly true.
Yeah. What do you do if some of those triggers in the negative thinking, like let's say, I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's say that someone works outside the home and they have to go to this place of business and there's a person there who they just absolutely scratch under their skin, right? And just causes all these, I'll call them character defects, but these, parts of myself that I don't like, for example, start coming out. And, how does one combat that and kind of start to change those narratives around, whatever that person thinks, it's actually not my business, but I just latch onto it anyway. And how do we start to kind of, and I know that's a little bit more maybe relationship based issue, but I think it's also with self because it's empowering to be able to walk into any situation, face a trigger, right, and handle it. So what would you say might be a good tool for that?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind, and we can see if this fits, but I'm always a big fan of asking ourselves a lot of really good questions whenever we have any kind of disturbance. So
yes,
the first sign of anything, whether you get a sick stomach, whether you're starting to get physical sensations, or whether you're just getting an emotion or an irritation, like I know I get kind of irritable, like I'll start to be like kind of grouchy around certain folks, or if somebody says a comment, I get annoyed. I think it's important to learn to have a couple. My two favorite are, what about this situation is really bothering me? And when you ask yourself that question and you genuinely do ask it and sit with it for a hot second, you're going to get some information back that either might be unexpected or just new, or, that you didn't think of before. And it might be that this person reminds you of, your aunt that always used to criticize you, and it's just really it's an unresolved trauma, or maybe the person is really crossing over some personal boundaries that you haven't really set or held firm. Now you have like some resentment because, like, say they are constantly asking you to work late. Hey, can you stay after work for an hour or two? I really need to get this project done. And you maybe have consistently said yes, because for a variety of reasons. Maybe you were too afraid to say no. You thought you might lose your job, or you were trying to be nice. And now you've kind of created a monster, and because you didn't have clear boundaries, and now you're resentful and angry about it. So that could be an answer that you get back when you ask yourself that question, like, what about this situation is really bothering me? And the other question that I always like to ask is, what am I afraid of?
Yep.
And I think that is so powerful because for me, my general first response to anything is always fear-based. And so We
Me
generally
too.
are afraid of losing something we have or not getting something we want. And
Yep.
so when we, again, genuinely ask yourself and sit with that question, what am I afraid of? And it might not be like, I'm afraid of a snake or a spider, stuff like that. It might be like, I'm afraid of my security is being threatened.
Yep.
The loss of the job threatens my security. And so I'm afraid that if I do a thing or I say a thing, that I'll have this loss, and it's a financial security, and maybe my ego will be bruised.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not getting someone's love or affection. Maybe if you act in a certain way or you speak up or something, you might not get somebody's attention and affection that you really want.
Mm-hmm.
And that can create a fear.
Yeah.
If you're a mother, like we both are, fear is a huge part of my story with my children.
Yeah.
It just is. It's never probably going to go away. I try to lessen it as best as I can. But a lot of my triggers come from them when they're doing certain things, or they are going certain places, or they are just entering a certain stage. And I ask myself those questions. What about this is bothering you? Well, most of it is around, I don't want them to be like me. I don't want them to have the same pain that I've had. Well, I can't take that away from them. And it's not really any of my business or my right to take away their pain as much as I want to. And all of us as moms wouldn't want to take them away from all of them, but if they don't have their own pain, then they can't have their own healing. So I think that's what I would say is the biggest thing in that situation. And just boundaries too. I think that's just a big underlying focused on. I think we hear the word, we hear it, and we see the plaques on Instagram and different things. But a lot of women, at least that I know, including myself at times, have never done any work around this and don't know how to do it.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
And so then they don't think they have a right to, stand up for themselves or speak up for themselves or say no or say yes or go here or there, whatever. So that's another big part.
Love that so much. And boundaries, right? Such a buzzword, like boundaries. Right. And
like
then,
mama.
right? Yeah. And then learning, the crazy thing about boundaries, right? That you sort of realize once you start doing some work on it, it's like, So even if I go to the trouble of setting up boundaries, like what if the person doesn't adhere to those boundaries? And now what do I do? And so learning how to kind of navigate all of that stuff is, it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of work and a lot of maintenance. And I think telling ourselves and explaining to ourselves, especially like in early sobriety and then beyond, like, teaching ourselves that we're worth it. That's a whole other learning curve, right? Like for me, it was at least doing all those uncomfortable things like those mirror reflection things where you look in the mirror and tell yourself you love yourself, like, but you know what? It works. It works. Those little things work. I mean, depending on your situation, but it worked for me. But, I have to say you have been such a trooper because I've had you all over the map with all these questions I've been asking, and I haven't even asked a thing about anxiety. So I thought like maybe for our last, as we're kind of wrapping up last portion of this, I could just ask you a little bit about anxiety. And the reason I bring this up, I mean, it's just so apropos. I love the way the universe works, God works, because, right before I jumped on with you, I was taking a class earlier today on the line, and they had us write down all of the buckets of things that we do. It was kind of like a time management exercise, I guess. What are the big buckets? And then, of course, like, what are the sub buckets within all of those buckets, right? And so what are the things that are your responsibilities within that? And I'm literally just like high level trying to do this exercise. And all of a sudden, I like looked down at my hand and I had a pen. And my hand is like white and I'm like gripping the pen. And then I notice like my mouth is dry. My heart is kind of starting to pick up pace. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like even writing this down is giving me anxiety because you're looking at it on all the things that I had to do. Right. And it was just kind of stressing me out. So I thought, well, this is ironic because I just wanted to ask you, what are your big, sort of practice items that we can adopt as we experience anxiety as as moms, as women, as citizens of this planet?
That's a great question and so important because I think that we, especially post-COVID, but it was happening before this too.
Yeah.
We do live in just this extremely anxious world. We're seeing it now. I mean, the research is showing it in young people for sure. There's a ton of it in even the little kids, definitely in the adolescent stage, and certainly for a lot of women and men. And I'm not a researcher. I don't begin to claim all the reasons for that, but anxiety is so it's kind of like grief in some ways. It's very personal and it affects each of us in a different way. Sometimes it can be very just like internal, kind of no one else would know. Like my husband is a super kind of high level professional, has been his whole life. He was a straight A student, all the high achieving stuff, but he really struggled with some performance anxiety and speaking in different things, but he had a job where he did that a lot. And so nobody would have ever said that about him, yet on the inside, it was a struggle for sure. And then some other things too, like related to maybe health or just fear-based. So some people are like that. Some people are much more outward, like you can see their physical responses, they're shaking, they're talking super fast or they're talking a lot about fear or just their anxiety, they're overwhelmed. I just think it's really personal, and it just shows up in different ways for people.
Yes.
As far as how do we kind of attack, did you ask me that? Like, how do we deal with it? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. I think that it's just important to understand that anxiety is just another feeling in the feeling world, right? It's just a thing. It's like anger or sadness or depression. It's just a part of the feeling family. And a lot of the successful work we can do around that is simply acknowledging that this is the experience you're having. Because a lot of times when we try to fight it off, like I'm not anxious, like I'm not doing that, and we try to pretend or we carry on and just ignore, it can make the problem like bigger and like explosive. And then we start to get into the panic and then it can get worse. Instead of starting to acknowledge, there's a great book, I didn't write it. It's called DARE. It's an acronym for something. It's a fabulous book about anxiety. And he speaks my language with a lot of this. And I just loved it so much. It talks a lot about just noticing the experience of having anxiety when you're having it, but then continuing to do whatever it is you're doing. So say you're going to the grocery store, you have trouble being out in public, you're pushing your cart, and all of a sudden you walk in the store and here you go. You're flooded with the energy. You're starting to feel it. He really, I'm simplifying it, obviously. He talked a lot about acknowledge, okay, yep, there it is. I feel you. I feel that anxiety coming in now. And that's all it is. It's just my anxiety here. It's arrived because I'm in the store and I'm just going to carry on and do my grocery shopping. And like learning how to just, and I'm not trying to minimize anybody's experience. Please don't take it that way. Because I understand that this can be very debilitating. And for those folks, you do need intervention. And when I do EMDR in my therapy practice, it's an extremely powerful tool to help deal with those kinds of debilitating anxiety because it all comes from somewhere. It doesn't just show up. It came from somewhere. And when we can get to those core issues and clean them out using real trauma therapy, you get a lot of that healing. But for the kind of everyday, like we're all dealing with just some of that natural stuff, really working with it and through it is the best solution, I think, in a lot of ways, as long as you're not going to be dangerous or I don't want anybody to get in a car accident or something, like, let's be safe, but the other thing that's super important, and I talk about in that little mini course that I did about dealing with anxiety in the moment, is physical activity. So physical activity, otherwise known as exercise, I don't like that word so much because sometimes it has a negative connotation, in particular for women. But physical movement of your body is one of the best medicines for anxiety that there is. It burns off the excess energy that we create when we're anxious. And it also helps to reduce the cortisol levels and sort of rid the body of some of those stress hormones. So you have to have daily movement in your life. I don't care what it is. You can take a dance class, you can go swimming, biking, jogging, take a yoga. I mean, whatever it is, you can walk up and down your steps or around your house. but creating some physical activity for, I usually say at least 20 minutes a day has got to be a priority for most people, because otherwise there's just no release of the excess.
Yeah.
So I think in the moment, those are some tools that are really, really powerful. More globally is to really deal with a lot of the stuff we already talked about. Like your thinking patterns, like establishing really healthy habits and routines. And I know I keep coming back to it, but when we start to do those things, and they're super simple things that we build on over time to create really strong patterns and habits, you will reduce your anxiety, because you'll create predictable environment in your life. You'll create the knowledge of self-care in your life, because when we take care of ourselves in that way, that is a form of self-care. And it's going to reduce the fear and worry and just anxiety of everyday life. It's going to keep you a little bit more in your moment. And when we have, like, particularly like a morning routine, for example, when you know that you're going to have that time with yourself, whatever that looks like for you, to maybe read or meditate, pray, whatever your thing is, and then work out, and you create time to do your meal prep in the morning, all of those things, that that's coming. And so it's like you're training your brain again to, as an insurance policy, like, okay, I've already done, no matter what happens today, I've had these moments with myself. I've checked in, I've taken care of myself. And if the rest of the day kind of goes to crap, at least I know I had this moment, right? And then you'll have it again tomorrow morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So good, because I think a lot of us tell ourselves, oh, I'm not a morning person. And again, that language kicking in, and then we're sort of proving to ourselves, like, it's like, no, start to kind of change it, reframe it. No, I am a morning person. I can become one, I'm capable of becoming one. And then having those routines established, gosh, it's so helpful. So true and so good. And I think, sometimes we have no routine to show us the joy that comes from having one, once we can see those differences. Shelby, I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming on the show today. I cannot tell you how valuable this will be for so many. And I'm wondering, where can people find you? And I'll link everything up, but yeah.
Of course, I have a website. It's just shelbyjohncoaching.com. Pretty much everything is accessible there. My podcast is even on that homepage if you want to listen to it there, or you can find it on all the platforms. It's called Confidence Over Women. I have that Facebook group that a lot of people hang out in called Confidence Over Women. It's free, private. Just come. I share a lot of content and offer, tools and strategies and learning and just support. And that's mostly where I hang out.
I love it so much. Thank you so much for all your wisdom, for sharing those tools with us today. Love it so much. And I wish you all the best. And remember, everybody, here's your bailout bag. Be kind, rewind. And I thank you so much for the honor of your time. What a gift it's been today. Take what you like and leave the rest behind.
That's right. Thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Eternally Amy. Amy Liz Harrison is a best-selling author, speaker, 12-step coach, meditation teacher, and recovery advocate. To find out more, please visit amylizharrison.com. Keep up with Amy on all platforms by following @AmyLizHarrison. Please subscribe and review this podcast. It means so much to us if you do.